Kira Blackwood had perfected the art of invisibility at Roosevelt High School, though it hadn't come easily. The skill had been honed through years of military base transfers, each new school presenting the same challenges: unfamiliar faces, established social hierarchies, and the exhausting process of trying to blend in before anyone noticed she was different. With her slight frame that barely cleared 5 feet 2 inches, oversized wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down her nose, and the habit of keeping her dark hair pulled forward like a protective curtain around her face, she moved through the crowded hallways like a ghost navigating between the living. Her clothes were always meticulously clean, a habit drilled into her by years of military precision, but never fashionable. She chose each piece deliberately, selecting muted colors and loose fits that would help her disappear into the background rather than make any kind of statement. Her backpack was a practical black canvas affair, sturdy enough to survive constant moves, but unremarkable enough to avoid drawing attention. She'd learned long ago that standing out in a new school was rarely a good thing, especially when your father wore a uniform and your family moved every year or two. Roosevelt High School squatted like a brick fortress on the outskirts of Fort Braxton, its architecture reflecting the utilitarian mindset of the nearby military base. The building was a maze of identical corridors painted in institutional beige, with lockers that had been repainted so many times their numbers were barely visible. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made even the healthiest students look pale and tired. The floors were polished linoleum that squeaked under sneakers and created an echo chamber of teenage voices, locker slams, and the constant shuffle of feet moving between classes. She transferred to Roosevelt 3 months ago when her father, Colonel James Blackwood, received new orders to Fort Braxton. It was her 6th school in as many years, and she'd harbored a secret hope that this time might be different. Maybe this time she could stay long enough to form real friendships, to be more than just the new girl who would disappear before anyone bothered to really know her. But within her first week at Roosevelt, she'd recognized the familiar patterns emerging: the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the careful way other students navigated around her as if her loneliness might be contagious. The cafeteria at Roosevelt High was a battlefield disguised as a dining hall, its geography as rigidly defined as any military campaign. The long rectangular tables were arranged in precise rows, like trenches, each one claiming territory for different social factions. The athletes commandeered the tables closest to the food line, their letter jackets and loud voices announcing their dominance. The popular girls held court near the windows, their perfectly styled hair and coordinated outfits creating an impenetrable wall of social hierarchy. The theater kids clustered around tables covered in script pages and costume sketches, their animated conversations mixing Shakespearean quotes with contemporary gossip. The gamers and tech enthusiasts had claimed the tables near the vending machines, their laptops and phone chargers creating a technological fortress. And then there were the outcasts, the students who didn't fit neatly into any category, who sat alone or in small defensive clusters at whatever tables remained unclaimed. Kira had naturally gravitated toward one of these peripheral territories, choosing a spot at the far end of a table near the emergency exit. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She was always ready to escape. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights were even harsher than those in the hallways, casting unflattering shadows across teenage faces and making the already unappetizing food look even less appealing. The walls were decorated with faded motivational posters featuring stock photos of diverse teenagers, supposedly inspired by education, their artificial smiles a stark contrast to the very real social warfare playing out beneath them. The smell of industrial-grade cleaning products mixed with the aroma of mass-produced food created an assault on the senses that Kira had learned to tune out through sheer necessity. She sat alone at her chosen table, methodically eating her sandwich while reading a worn paperback copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It was one of several military strategy books her father had recommended, though she doubted he'd expected her to find practical applications for ancient Chinese warfare tactics in navigating high school social dynamics. The book was dog-eared and annotated with her careful notes, its pages soft from repeated handling. She'd learned to eat quickly and quietly, finishing her meal before anyone had time to notice her presence and decide she might be worth bothering. The sandwich was nothing special, turkey and cheese on wheat bread, packed with the same military efficiency her father applied to everything else. She'd made it herself that morning in the kitchen of their latest base housing unit, a cookie-cutter dwelling identical to dozens of others she'd called home over the years. The house was functional but sterile, with white walls that couldn't be painted without permission, and furniture that was built to withstand the wear and tear of constant military families moving in and out. Her room was sparse by necessity. She'd learned not to accumulate too many possessions that would just need to be packed up again in a year or two. As she read about the importance of knowing your enemy's weaknesses, Kira was acutely aware of the social ecosystem functioning around her. She developed an almost supernatural ability to read the mood of a room, to sense trouble approaching long before it materialized. It was a survival skill honed through years of being the outsider, the one who had to quickly assess new social hierarchies and find her place, or more accurately, find the safest place to hide until she moved again. Today, her carefully cultivated invisibility was about to fail her. "Look what we have here," came a voice dripping with manufactured charm, the kind of false friendliness that immediately set Kira's nerves on edge. Her shoulders tensed without her looking up, muscles automatically preparing for confrontation even as her mind counseled patience. She recognized the voice of Blake Morrison, Roosevelt High School's self-appointed king of cruelty, though she'd been hoping to avoid his attention for at least another few weeks. Blake Morrison was everything Kira wasn't. Tall at 6'1", broad-shouldered from years of playing linebacker on the varsity football team, with the kind of confident swagger that came from never having to question his place in the world. His sandy brown hair was always perfectly styled in the latest fashion, cut and maintained by an expensive barber in town, rather than the base barbershop that most military kids frequented. His clothes screamed expensive casualness, designer jeans that cost more than Kira's entire wardrobe, sneakers that were limited editions purchased the moment they released, and a varsity jacket that hung on his frame like a royal robe. But it wasn't Blake's physical presence that made him dangerous. It was his instinctive understanding of social dynamics, his ability to identify weakness and exploit it with surgical precision. He moved through the school's social hierarchy like a predator who had never known fear, secure in the knowledge that his family's money, his athletic achievements, and his natural charisma had granted him a form of teenage royalty that seemed unassailable. Blake approached with his usual entourage, a carefully curated collection of followers who had attached themselves to his star for protection and reflected glory. Trevor Mills was his most loyal lieutenant, a stocky junior with dead eyes and quick fists who served as Blake's enforcer. Where Blake preferred psychological warfare, Trevor was always ready to resort to physical intimidation. His knuckles bore the faint scars of too many fights, and his reputation for sudden violence kept even some of the larger students from challenging Blake's authority. Jessica Hartwell completed their toxic triangle, her beauty matched only by her talent for psychological warfare. She was the kind of girl who could smile while delivering the most cutting insult, whose perfectly applied makeup and designer clothes served as armor in her personal war against anyone she deemed unworthy of her attention. Her long blonde hair was always immaculately styled, and she moved with the calculated grace of someone who had learned to weaponize her appearance. Together, They moved through the cafeteria like sharks, sensing blood in the water, their predatory instincts finely tuned after years of establishing and maintaining their dominance. Other students automatically moved out of their way, conversations pausing as they passed, everyone hoping to avoid becoming their next target. The trio had an almost supernatural ability to appear whenever someone was most vulnerable, most isolated, most likely to provide the kind of entertainment they craved. Today, Kira was bleeding invisible blood, her loneliness and isolation marking her as prey in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Earth to freak," Blake said, snapping his fingers inches from Kira's face with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions. The sound was sharp and insulting, designed to startle and humiliate. "I'm talking to you." Kira slowly raised her eyes from her book, her movement deliberate and controlled. She'd learned that sudden movements could be interpreted as either fear or aggression, both of which tended to escalate confrontations. Her expression remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She'd perfected this mask over years of dealing with bullies and authority figures alike, a facade of bland compliance that revealed nothing of her true thoughts or capabilities. "I'm just eating lunch," she said quietly, her voice pitched to carry no challenge while also refusing to show submission. It was a careful balance, one that required constant recalibration depending on the type of predator she was facing. "Just eating lunch," Jessica mimicked in an exaggerated baby voice, her tone dripping with condescension. The imitation was cruel in its accuracy, capturing not just Kira's words, but the careful, measured way she'd delivered them. Several nearby students snickered at the performance, their laughter serving as validation for Jessica's cruelty. "Aw, look at her. She thinks she can just sit here like a normal person." The laughter stung more than Kira wanted to admit. She'd spent 3 months carefully observing the social dynamics of Roosevelt High, trying to understand the unwritten rules that governed teenage interaction. Apparently, one of those rules was that her very presence was somehow offensive to the established order. She wondered, not for the first time, what it was about her that seemed to attract this kind of attention. Was it her obvious status as an outsider, her military background, the careful way she held herself apart from the social games that consumed most of her peers? Trevor reached over with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no and flicked Kira's book out of her hands. The paperback flew across the table and skittered to the floor, its pages fluttering open like broken wings. Several loose notes she'd tucked between the pages scattered across the linoleum, her careful observations about military strategy now exposed and vulnerable. "What's this garbage? The art of war, planning to take over the chess club, military brat." Kira's jaw clenched at the term military brat, a designation that had followed her through every school, every move, every attempt to fit in somewhere new. It was meant to be insulting, implying that military children were somehow damaged, rootless, lacking in the stability that civilians took for granted. There was truth to it, certainly, but it wasn't the weakness her tormentors assumed it to be. Military children learned adaptability, resilience, and survival skills that their civilian peers never developed. They learned to assess threats, to read situations quickly, and to make hard decisions without the luxury of time or certainty. But they also learned to hide these strengths, to present themselves as harmless and compliant, to avoid drawing unwanted attention from those who might feel threatened by their competence. Kira started to stand, intending to retrieve her book and her scattered notes, but Blake's hand shot out with surprising speed, pressing against her chest and pushing her back into her seat. His touch was brief but aggressive, a clear assertion of dominance that sent a message to everyone watching. This girl belonged to him now, at least for the duration of this entertainment. Did I say you could move? Dave Blake's voice carried the authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged, the casual confidence of a predator who had learned that most prey would submit rather than fight back. The cafeteria had grown quieter around them, other students sensing drama but carefully avoiding direct involvement. It was a familiar dynamic Kira had observed in every school she'd attended. Students who might individually be decent people became passive spectators when confronted with organized cruelty. They were afraid of becoming targets themselves, afraid of disrupting social hierarchies they didn't fully understand, afraid of the consequences of standing up to those who held power. She could see them in her peripheral vision, some watching openly with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest, others stealing glances while pretending to focus on their own meals. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable, but none made any move to intervene. The unwritten rules of high school social warfare were clear. Don't get involved unless you want to become the next target. Kira's eyes darted around the room, looking for any teacher or adult authority figure who might intervene. Mrs. Patterson, the lunch monitor, was stationed at the far end of the cafeteria, but she was completely engrossed in her smartphone, scrolling through what looked like social media posts with the glazed expression of someone mentally checked out from her responsibilities. Her position was supposed to provide supervision and safety, but she was clearly more interested in her digital life than the very real dynamics playing out under her nominal watch. This was another pattern Kira had observed throughout her educational career. Adults who were physically present but emotionally and intellectually absent, leaving students to navigate complex social hierarchies without guidance or protection. It was a systemic failure that created opportunities for predators like Blake to operate with impunity, knowing that their actions would likely go unnoticed and unpunished. "Please," Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper, pitched to convey submission without complete capitulation. "I don't want any trouble." It was a lie, of course. Part of her, a part that had been carefully trained and honed by years of military discipline, wanted very much to give Blake and his followers the kind of trouble they'd never forget. She could visualize exactly how the confrontation would unfold, could see the precise movements that would disable each of her tormentors with maximum efficiency and minimum effort. Her father's training had been thorough and professional, designed to create a warrior capable of handling threats far more dangerous than high school bullies. But her father had also taught her restraint, had drilled into her the importance of choosing battles wisely and understanding the consequences of violence. A weapon that cannot be controlled is more dangerous to its wielder than its target, he'd often said during their training sessions in various base gyms and dojos around the world. "Too late for that," Blake said, his smile turning predatory as he sensed her vulnerability. He grabbed Kira's lunch tray with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted and tilted it slightly, letting her red apple roll off and bounce across the floor with hollow thumps that seemed unnaturally loud in the increasingly quiet cafeteria. "Oops, butterfingers." The apple came to rest near the feet of a group of sophomore girls who glanced at it, then at Kira, then quickly away. Their expressions held a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for Kira's situation and relief that they weren't the ones drawing Blake's attention. It was another example of the social dynamics Kira had learned to read, the complex calculus of teenage survival that determined who would be sacrificed to preserve the safety of others. What Blake and his friends didn't know, what no one at Roosevelt High knew, was that Kira Blackwood had been trained by one of the most decorated Special Forces operatives in the United States military. Her father, Colonel James Blackwood, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, earning commendations for valor that he kept locked away in a desk drawer rather than displayed on his walls. He'd seen combat in some of the world's most dangerous places, had faced enemies who would have considered Blake Morrison's casual cruelty to be laughably amateur. When Kira turned 12 and began experiencing the challenges that came with constant relocation and social readjustment, her father had made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. Rather than simply offering advice or hoping she would learn to cope on her own, he began training her in the same disciplines that had kept him alive in combat zones around the world. The training had started with basic physical fitness, but quickly evolved into something far more comprehensive. In the converted garages and spare rooms of various base housing units, Kira learned Krav Maga, the Israeli martial art designed for real-world self-defense situations. Unlike traditional martial arts that emphasized form and ceremony, Krav Maga was purely practical, focused on neutralizing threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. She learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which taught her how to use leverage and technique to overcome opponents who were larger and stronger. Hours spent rolling on mats with her father and occasionally with other military personnel had given her an intuitive understanding of body mechanics, pressure points, and the precise application of force needed to control or disable an opponent. But perhaps most importantly, she learned combat psychology, how to read threats, how to de-escalate when possible, and how to strike decisively when de-escalation failed. Her father taught her to recognize the signs of impending violence, to assess multiple opponents quickly, and to maintain emotional control even in high-stress situations. The training sessions were rigorous and demanding, often lasting for hours after her regular homework was completed. Her father was a patient but uncompromising instructor, demanding precision and discipline in every movement. "Violence is a tool of last resort," he'd always said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "A smart warrior chooses their battles, but when the battle is unavoidable, she ends it quickly and decisively." These weren't abstract concepts to Colonel Blackwood. He'd applied these principles in situations where the stakes were life and death, where hesitation or poor judgment could result in not just personal failure, but the deaths of soldiers under his command. The lessons he passed on to his daughter were born from real experience, tested in actual combat, and proven effective against enemies far more dangerous than high school bullies. But along with these formidable skills came an equally important lesson in restraint. Her father had seen too many soldiers who became addicted to violence, who lost the ability to distinguish between necessary force and unnecessary brutality. He was determined that his daughter would possess both the capability to defend herself and the wisdom to know when such defense was truly necessary. So Kira endured Blake's harassment with the patience of someone who knew exactly how easily she could end it. She cleaned up her scattered lunch with methodical precision, ignoring the laughter and whispered comments from the growing audience of spectators. She picked up her book and carefully collected her fallen notes, smoothing out wrinkled pages with the same attention to detail her father applied to cleaning his service weapon. She promised herself that this too would pass, that eventually Blake would find new targets or new entertainment, that she just needed to maintain her invisibility until her father received new orders and they moved to another base, another school, another chance to start over. She'd survived 4 different high schools in 6 years, each with its own unique challenges and social hierarchies. She could survive Roosevelt High School. But the bullying only escalated, as it almost always did when predators sensed vulnerability without consequence. The next major incident happened on a Thursday morning between second and third period in the hallway that connected the main academic building to the science wing. It was one of the busiest corridors in the school during class changes, with students streaming in both directions as they navigated between classrooms. The hallway was lined with lockers painted in the school colors, navy blue and gold, and decorated with motivational banners celebrating various achievements and upcoming events. Kira was walking alone to her advanced placement chemistry class, her backpack loaded with textbooks and the chemistry notebook she'd been meticulously maintaining since the beginning of the semester. She'd always excelled in sciences, finding comfort in their logical structure and predictable outcomes. Chemistry in particular appealed to her analytical mind, with its precise formulas and measurable reactions providing a stark contrast to the chaotic unpredictability of teenage social dynamics. She was reviewing her notes on molecular bonds, trying to prepare for a quiz she knew was coming, when she felt someone deliberately bump into her shoulder. It wasn't the accidental contact that was inevitable in crowded hallways. This was calculated, forceful enough to send her sprawling across the polished linoleum floor, with her books scattering in multiple directions. Her chemistry notebook flew open, its carefully organized pages spreading across the hallway like fallen leaves. Months of detailed notes, practice problems, and lab observations were suddenly exposed to the foot traffic of passing students. Her calculator skittered under a bank of lockers, and her textbooks landed with heavy thuds that echoed off the painted concrete walls. "Watch where you're going, freak!" Blake's voice came from behind her, carrying just enough volume to ensure that passing students would hear and understand what was happening. The hallway was full of witnesses, but their reactions followed a predictable pattern Kira had observed countless times before. Some students stopped to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to barely concealed entertainment. Others walked around the scene as if it were an inevitable obstacle, like construction work or a spilled drink that maintenance hadn't yet cleaned up. A few even participated in the humiliation, deliberately stepping on her scattered papers or giving her books additional kicks that sent them sliding further down the hallway. Kira remained on the floor for a moment longer than necessary, not because she was injured. The fall had been awkward but harmless, but because she was using the time to observe the reactions around her and to maintain emotional control. Getting up immediately would have shown that she was unaffected, which might have prompted Blake to escalate the confrontation. Staying down too long would have displayed weakness and invited further abuse. She needed to find the precise balance that would satisfy Blake's need for dominance while minimizing additional harm. As she gathered her belongings, she could feel dozens of eyes on her, but not one person offered to help. This wasn't necessarily because her fellow students were cruel. Many of them were probably decent people who might have assisted her under different circumstances. But they understood the social dynamics at play, knew that helping Blake's target would potentially make them targets as well. It was a form of social self-preservation that she couldn't entirely blame them for, even as it left her completely isolated. Emma Rodriguez, a quiet junior who sometimes sat near Kira in chemistry class, looked like she wanted to help. Emma paused in her walk to class, her expression clearly conflicted as she watched Kira collecting her scattered belongings. But after a glance in Blake's direction, she continued walking, her shoulders slightly hunched with what Kira recognized as shame and self-preservation warring against basic human decency. Kira understood. Getting involved meant risking Blake's attention, and Blake's attention was rarely pleasant for anyone other than his chosen inner circle. Emma was smart to keep walking, even if the decision clearly bothered her. By the time Kira had gathered all of her belongings and made it to chemistry class, she was 3 minutes late. Mrs. Chen, the chemistry teacher, gave her a questioning look, but didn't comment on her tardiness. Kira wondered if Mrs. Chen had heard about the hallway incident. News traveled fast in high schools, especially when it involved public humiliation. But the teacher simply nodded toward Kira's assigned laboratory station and continued with her preparation for the day's lesson. Kira's lab station was located near the back of the classroom, paired with Emma Rodriguez for the semester-long partnership that Mrs. Chen had assigned based on complementary academic strengths. It was a practical pairing. Kira excelled at theoretical chemistry, while Emma had an intuitive grasp of laboratory procedures. but it had also become one of the few bright spots in Kira's experience at Roosevelt High. But today, even that small comfort was tainted. When Kira opened her chemistry notebook to review her notes from the previous class, she discovered that someone had written "loser" across the cover in black permanent marker. The letters were large and crude, clearly visible to anyone who might glance in her direction. The ink had soaked through the cover and into the first several pages, ruining weeks of carefully organized notes and observations. Emma saw the vandalism, and her face immediately flushed with anger and embarrassment on Kira's behalf. "That's horrible," she whispered, glancing around the classroom to make sure no one else had noticed. Who would do something like that? It was a rhetorical question. They both knew exactly who would do something like that. Blake's reach extended far beyond his physical presence, encompassing a network of followers and wannabes who were eager to earn his approval through acts of petty cruelty. Someone in their extended social circle had access to Kira's locker combination, or had somehow gained entry to the chemistry classroom before the school day began, specifically to deliver this message of contempt. Emma pulled a black marker from her pencil case and began carefully trying to modify the vandalism, turning the insulting word into something less hurtful through strategic additions and alterations. It was a small gesture, but it represented the first time since arriving at Roosevelt that someone had actively tried to help Kira, rather than simply avoiding getting involved in her problems. "Thank you," Kira said quietly, meaning it more than Emma could possibly understand. The kindness was unexpected and genuine, a reminder that not everyone at Roosevelt High was either a predator or a passive bystander. But even Emma's friendship came with limitations imposed by social necessity. When Mrs. Chen announced the day's lab assignment and students began moving around the classroom to gather equipment, Emma gave Kira a sympathetic look, but said nothing more about the vandalized notebook. She understood, as they all did, that drawing additional attention to Blake's harassment would only make things worse for everyone involved. The pattern continued and intensified over the following weeks, with Blake and his crew seeming to make tormenting Kira their personal mission. They had an uncanny ability to appear whenever she was most vulnerable, always when no teachers were present in the immediate vicinity, always with just enough witnesses to maximize her humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by authority figures. They cornered her in the library during her lunch period, positioning themselves at her table while she tried to complete homework assignments in the relative peace of the reference section. Blake would lean over her shoulder, making loud observations about her work that were designed to sound helpful to casual observers, while actually being deeply insulting. "Wow, is that really how you solve that problem? I guess military schools don't teach math the same way we do here," he'd say, his voice carrying just far enough to draw attention from other students trying to study. Jessica would add her own commentary, always delivered with a smile that made her words sound friendly to anyone not paying close attention. It's so interesting how some people approach things differently. I mean, we all learn at our own pace, right? The implication was clear to Kira and devastating in its casual cruelty. She was being categorized as slow, different, somehow deficient compared to the normal students who belonged at Roosevelt High. Trevor's contributions were less subtle, but equally effective. He would deliberately bump into her chair, causing her to make mistakes in her carefully written homework. He would accidentally knock her books off the table, then apologize with exaggerated concern, while making no effort to help her retrieve them. His physical presence was intimidating in itself. He was built like the wrestler he'd been before a knee injury ended his athletic career, with broad shoulders and thick arms that suggested he was always ready to escalate beyond verbal harassment. The library incidents were particularly frustrating because the space was supposed to be a sanctuary. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head librarian, was generally sympathetic to students who were having social difficulties, but she was also responsible for maintaining order and quiet in a space used by hundreds of students throughout the day. When Blake's group arrived at Kira's table, they were technically not breaking any rules. They spoke in whispers, they weren't overtly aggressive, and they left when asked to move along. By the time Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that something was wrong, the damage was already done, and the perpetrators were gone. They followed her to the parking lot after school, timing their appearances to coincide with her walk to the bus stop, where she caught the base shuttle back to Fort Braxton. The parking lot was a chaotic mix of student drivers, parent pickup lines, and various school buses, providing perfect cover for seemingly accidental encounters that were anything but accidental. Blake would drive slowly beside her as she walked, his expensive sedan purring at idle, while he made loud comments about her military daddy and whether he'd taught her to kill people like he does. The questions were designed to be overheard by other students, to plant seeds of fear and suspicion about Kira's background and capabilities. It was psychological warfare of a sophisticated kind, aimed at isolating her even further from potential allies by making her seem dangerous and unpredictable. Jessica would contribute from the passenger seat, her voice artificially sweet, as she asked questions that were actually accusations. Do you miss moving around all the time? It must be hard to make friends when you know you're just going to leave again. I guess that's why some people don't even try to fit in. Every word was calculated to reinforce Kira's status as an outsider, someone who was fundamentally different from the stable-rooted community of students who belonged at Roosevelt High. The parking lot harassment was particularly effective because it occurred in a space that was technically public, but practically unsupervised. Teachers were busy with after-school duties, parents were focused on collecting their own children, and bus drivers were concerned with schedules and safety regulations. Blake's group could operate freely in this transitional space, knowing that by the time any adult authority figure noticed what was happening, everyone would be gone. Sometimes they would recruit other students to participate, turning Kira's isolation into a form of school-wide entertainment. Underclassmen looking to gain social status would volunteer to deliver messages or participate in pranks. Older students who should have known better would laugh at Blake's performances, their approval encouraging further escalation. One particularly cruel incident involved a fake invitation to a party that was supposedly being thrown by one of the popular seniors. The invitation was elaborate, printed on quality paper, and delivered to Kira's locker with apparent sincerity. It included specific details about the date, time, and location, along with a note suggesting that the host was interested in getting to know her better. Kira was skeptical. She had no reason to believe that any of Roosevelt's popular students would want to include her in their social activities. But the invitation was convincing enough that she allowed herself to hope. Maybe her careful efforts to remain invisible had been too successful. Maybe there were students who wanted to be friends but hadn't known how to approach her. On the night of the supposed party, she walked to the address listed on the invitation, only to discover that it was a vacant lot next to a closed gas station. She stood there for 20 minutes, feeling increasingly foolish, before realizing that she'd been the victim of an elaborate prank. The next day at school, word of her gullibility had spread throughout the social networks that Blake controlled, providing fresh ammunition for weeks of additional harassment. "Did you have fun at the party?" became a standard greeting from Blake's followers, delivered with grins that made it clear they were all in on the joke. "We heard it was really exclusive, just you and the raccoons in that vacant lot." Through all of this escalating harassment, Kira remained silent and disciplined, following the principles her father had taught her about choosing battles wisely. Every night, she would return to the garage of their base housing unit and work through combat drills with methodical precision. her movements fluid and deadly accurate as she practiced techniques that could disable multiple attackers in seconds. The garage had been converted into a makeshift dojo with mats covering the concrete floor and mirrors mounted on the walls to allow her to observe and correct her form. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling mounts, and a collection of training weapons, padded sticks, practice knives, and foam replica firearms were organized with military precision on wall-mounted racks. Her training sessions were intense and focused, lasting for hours as she worked through combinations and scenarios that her father had taught her. She could break boards with her bare hands, execute throws that would send a grown man flying through the air, and strike with enough force and precision to disable an opponent's joints or pressure points. Her movements were economical and efficient, wasting no energy on flashy techniques that might look impressive but serve no practical purpose. But more than just physical techniques, she practiced the mental discipline that separated trained fighters from mere brawlers. She learned to control her breathing under stress, to maintain situational awareness even during combat, and to make tactical decisions in fractions of seconds. She practiced scenarios where she was outnumbered, outweighed, and surprised, learning to turn disadvantages into advantages through superior technique and mental preparation. Every training session ended with meditation, a period of stillness where she would review the day's events and assess her emotional responses. Her father had taught her that anger was a dangerous emotion in combat. It clouded judgment, wasted energy, and led to mistakes that could be fatal in real confrontations. She learned to acknowledge her feelings without being controlled by them, to maintain the kind of cold, tactical thinking that would allow her to respond appropriately when the time came. But despite her formidable capabilities, she held back from using them. Her father's words echoed in her mind every time she felt the urge to respond to Blake's provocations with violence. The strongest person in the room is often the one who chooses not to fight. True strength isn't about dominating others, it's about protecting what matters while maintaining control of yourself. Colonel Blackwood had seen too many soldiers who became addicted to violence, who lost the ability to distinguish between necessary force and unnecessary brutality. He'd watched good people become something darker when they allowed anger and frustration to override their training and judgment. His lessons to Kira were designed not just to make her capable of defending herself, but to ensure that she would retain her humanity, even if circumstances forced her to use violence. So, she endured. She went to class, completed her assignments with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything she did, and tried to become even more invisible. She told herself that high school was temporary, that Blake's harassment would eventually end either through boredom or through her family's inevitable transfer to another base. She reminded herself that bigger challenges awaited her in the adult world, and that learning to handle petty cruelty from teenagers would prepare her for more serious adversities later in life. But every person has limits, and even the most disciplined warrior can be pushed beyond the point of restraint. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in November, when the first frost of the season had painted the base housing windows with delicate crystal patterns, and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Kira had been assigned to work with Emma Rodriguez on a major chemistry project worth 25% of their semester grade, an analysis of chemical reactions in everyday household products that required weeks of research, experimentation, and documentation. Emma Rodriguez was one of the few students at Roosevelt High who had consistently treated Kira with basic human decency. She was a quiet, intelligent junior with shoulder-length black hair and serious brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that were similar to Kira's own. Emma's family had immigrated from Mexico when she was 7, and she understood something about being an outsider in established social systems, though her challenges were different from those faced by military children. Over the course of their chemistry partnership, Emma and Kira had developed a tentative friendship that existed primarily within the confines of the classroom and laboratory. Emma was genuinely interested in Kira's thoughts and opinions, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a social pariah. She asked thoughtful questions about military life, not from morbid curiosity, but from genuine interest in understanding different ways of living. Their conversations had gradually expanded beyond academic topics to include books, movies, and shared observations about the social dynamics they witnessed daily at Roosevelt High. Emma had a dry sense of humor that complemented Kira's more serious nature, and she possessed the kind of analytical intelligence that allowed her to see through the superficial hierarchies that dominated teenage social life. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt, Kira felt like she might have found someone who saw her as more than just a target or a curiosity. Emma didn't seem intimidated by Kira's military background or her natural reserve. Instead, she appeared to appreciate Kira's thoughtful approach to problems and her refusal to participate in the petty dramas that consumed most of their peers. Their chemistry project had been going well, with both students contributing their complementary strengths to create what they hoped would be an impressive final presentation. Kira's theoretical knowledge, combined with Emma's practical laboratory skills, had produced results that exceeded what either could have accomplished working alone. They'd spent hours after school in the chemistry lab, carefully documenting their experiments and analyzing their findings with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that their teacher clearly appreciated. On this particular Tuesday, they were walking together toward the science wing during the brief transitional period between lunch and fifth period. The hallways were mostly empty. Most students were either still in the cafeteria finishing their meals or already in their classrooms preparing for afternoon classes. It was a time of day when the school felt almost peaceful, when the constant noise and chaos of teenage social interaction was temporarily suspended. Kira was carrying her chemistry notebook and a folder containing their project research, while Emma held a box of materials they'd been approved to take from the laboratory for additional testing. They were discussing their plans for the final phase of their experiments, debating the best methods for presenting their conclusions in a way that would be both scientifically accurate and accessible to their classmates. It was the kind of intellectual conversation that Kira treasured, a reminder that school could be about learning and discovery rather than just survival and social navigation. Emma's insights were genuinely helpful, and her enthusiasm for their project was infectious. For a few minutes, Kira allowed herself to forget about Blake Morrison and his crew, to imagine what school might be like if she could focus entirely on academics and friendship without the constant threat of harassment and humiliation. That brief moment of peace was about to be shattered. Blake Morrison, Trevor Mills, and Jessica Hartwell materialized in the hallway ahead of them like predators emerging from camouflage. Their timing was perfect. They had clearly been waiting for this opportunity, watching from some concealed position until Kira and Emma were isolated and vulnerable. The hallway was mostly empty, with only a few scattered students visible in the distance and no teachers or authority figures anywhere in sight. Blake positioned himself directly in their path, his body language radiating the casual confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged. His varsity jacket was unzipped, revealing a designer t-shirt that probably cost more than most students' entire outfits, and his perfectly styled hair caught the fluorescent light in a way that seemed calculated to emphasize his conventional attractiveness. Trevor and Jessica flanked him in a formation that they'd clearly used many times before, creating a human barrier that blocked any easy escape route. Trevor's presence was particularly intimidating, his stocky build and scarred knuckles serving as silent reminders of his willingness to escalate beyond verbal harassment. Jessica's contribution was more subtle but equally effective. her perfectly applied makeup and expensive clothing serving as visual reinforcement of the social hierarchy they represented. "Well, well," Blake said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of false friendliness that immediately put Kira on high alert. "Look who found herself a friend." Emma instinctively stepped closer to Kira, a movement that was both protective and seeking protection. Kira could feel the tension radiating from her lab partner, could sense Emma's growing fear as she realized they'd walked into a carefully planned confrontation. Emma had witnessed Blake's treatment of Kira from a distance, but this was the first time she'd found herself directly in his crosshairs. "We're just going to class," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly despite her obvious effort to project confidence. She held the box of chemistry materials closer to her chest, using it as a kind of shield against the hostility radiating from Blake's group. "I wasn't talking to you," Blake snapped, his facade of false friendliness dropping instantly, his eyes fixed on Emma with a calculating look that made Kira's skin crawl. The same predatory assessment she'd seen him apply to other potential victims. "Actually, Emma, I've been thinking. You're too pretty to be hanging around with trash like this." The comment was designed to drive a wedge between the two girls, to offer Emma an escape route that would require her to abandon Kira. It was a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation, appealing to Emma's self-preservation instincts while simultaneously insulting Kira in the most personal way possible. Blake understood that breaking up alliances was often more effective than direct confrontation, that isolated targets were always easier to control. Other students began to notice the confrontation, emerging from classrooms or appearing at the ends of nearby hallways. Word spread quickly through the informal communication networks that existed in every high school, and soon a loose circle of spectators had formed around the confrontation. Some watched with open curiosity, others with barely concealed excitement at the prospect of drama, and a few with the uncomfortable expressions of people who knew they should intervene but lacked the courage to do so. Kira recognized the familiar pattern developing. The growing audience, the increasing pressure for some kind of resolution, the way Blake fed off the attention and validation of his peers. She'd seen variations of this scenario play out in every school she'd attended, and she knew that the presence of spectators would make Blake more likely to escalate, more determined to provide the kind of entertainment that would enhance his reputation. "Just leave us alone," Emma said, but her voice was getting smaller as she realized the hopelessness of their situation. Blake ignored her completely, focusing his attention on Kira with the intensity of a predator who had cornered particularly interesting prey. "You know what I think? I think you're using Emma here, making her feel sorry for you so she'll do your homework. That's pretty pathetic, even for you." The accusation was particularly cruel because it attacked one of the few genuine relationships Kira had managed to form at Roosevelt High. Blake was trying to poison Emma's perception of their friendship, to make her question whether Kira's interest in their partnership was authentic or manipulative. It was psychological warfare of a sophisticated kind, designed to isolate Kira even further while simultaneously insulting her character and intelligence. "That's not true," Emma protested, showing more courage than Kira had expected. Her voice was still shaky, but there was real anger in it now, indignation at Blake's attempt to characterize their friendship in such degrading terms. "Kira's the smartest person in our chemistry class. She's been helping me understand concepts I never would have figured out on my own." Blake's expression darkened at Emma's defense of Kira. He wasn't accustomed to having his narratives challenged, especially not by someone he'd categorized as a potential ally rather than an enemy. Emma's loyalty to Kira represented a failure of his psychological manipulation, a reminder that his power over other students wasn't as absolute as he liked to believe. "Emma, sweetie, you don't need to defend her," Blake said, his tone shifting to condescending paternalism. "Everyone knows what she is." His voice carried across the hallway, ensuring that every member of their growing audience could hear his next words clearly. Her daddy's a baby killer, and she's just a weird little freak who probably tortures animals in her spare time. The words hit Kira like physical blows, each one carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. The accusation against her father was particularly devastating because it attacked not just her own reputation, but that of a man she respected and loved above all others. Colonel Blackwood had served his country with honor and distinction, had risked his life repeatedly to protect people who would never know his name or appreciate his sacrifices. But Blake's attack wasn't really about facts or evidence. It was about creating a narrative that would justify his treatment of Kira while simultaneously making it impossible for other students to sympathize with her. By characterizing her as dangerous and unpredictable, he was laying the groundwork for whatever escalation he planned next. Kira felt her hands clench into fists, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that her body produced in response to threats. But she forced herself to remain calm, to maintain the emotional control that her father had drilled into her through countless hours of training. Getting angry would only validate Blake's characterization of her as unstable and dangerous. Losing control would give him exactly what he wanted, justification for whatever retaliation he had planned. "Come on, Emma," Kira said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Let's just go around them." But as they tried to move past Blake's group, he made the fatal mistake that would finally push Kira beyond her carefully maintained limits of restraint. Blake reached out and grabbed Emma's arm, his grip tight enough to make her wince and drop her box of chemistry materials. Glass containers and chemical samples scattered across the hallway floor, weeks of careful work destroyed in an instant. But it wasn't the destruction of their project that triggered Kira's response. It was the look of fear and pain in Emma's eyes as Blake's fingers dug into her arm. "I said I wasn't done talking," Blake announced, his grip on Emma's arm serving as both a display of dominance and a threat of escalation. Emma tried to pull away, but Blake's hold was too strong. Kira could see the white marks where his fingers pressed into Emma's skin, could see tears forming in her friend's eyes as fear and pain combined with the humiliation of being manhandled in front of their growing audience of spectators. In that moment, something inside Kira shifted fundamentally. Not anger. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in a tactical situation. What she felt was something much colder and more dangerous. The absolute clarity that came when training and instinct aligned to identify a threat that required immediate neutralization. Blake Morrison had just crossed a line that Kira's training and moral code absolutely forbade anyone to cross. By putting his hands on Emma, by using physical intimidation against someone who couldn't defend herself, he had transformed their confrontation from psychological warfare into something that demanded a physical response. Her father's words echoed in her mind, but now they carried a different meaning. A smart warrior chooses their battles. This wasn't a battle she had chosen, but it was one that had chosen her. And now that the choice had been made, her training and instincts took over with surgical precision. The discipline her father had taught her was still there, but now it served a different purpose. She was no longer holding back to avoid conflict. She was calculating the most efficient way to end it while minimizing harm to everyone involved, except the person who had initiated the violence. "Let go of her," Kira said, her voice completely steady and carrying a tone that several students would later describe as absolutely terrifying in its calmness. Blake laughed, the sound harsh and confident in the echoing hallway. His grip on Emma's arm tightened, and Kira could see her friend trying not to cry from the pain. "Or what? You gonna tell your daddy on me?" The mockery in his voice was designed to provoke an emotional response, to goad Kira into acting rashly and providing justification for whatever retaliation he had planned. But Blake had fundamentally misunderstood what he was dealing with. Kira wasn't an emotional teenager who could be manipulated through insults and threats. She was a trained warrior who had just witnessed an unacceptable act of aggression against someone under her protection. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Kira said, stepping closer with the fluid movement of someone whose body was perfectly balanced and ready for action. Her posture had changed subtly but significantly. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, her shoulders relaxed but prepared, her hands loose at her sides but positioned for instant response. "Let go of her." Students in the crowd began to sense that something had shifted in the dynamic of the confrontation. Kira's voice carried a quality they'd never heard before, a certainty and authority that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the hallway. Some of the spectators took unconscious steps backward, their survival instincts warning them that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Trevor started to move forward, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond Blake's usual psychological intimidation tactics. But something in Kira's stance, in the way she tracked his movement while maintaining focus on Blake, made him hesitate. For the first time in his career as Blake's enforcer, Trevor found himself facing someone who didn't seem intimidated by his reputation for violence. "Make me," Blake said, reaching for Kira with his free hand while maintaining his painful grip on Emma's arm. It was the last mistake he would make in what had been a very successful career of intimidating other students. Blake never saw Kira's response coming, despite the fact that she moved with deliberate precision rather than explosive speed. Her reaction was instantaneous and surgical, the product of thousands of hours of training condensed into a sequence of movements that lasted less than 3 seconds, but would be remembered and discussed by witnesses for years to come. Kira caught Blake's wrist as he reached for her, her fingers finding the precise pressure point that would cause maximum pain while maintaining complete control of his movement. Her grip was positioned with scientific accuracy, thumb and forefinger applying pressure to nerve clusters that her father had taught her to locate by touch, creating a level of discomfort that would immediately compromise Blake's ability to think clearly or coordinate his actions. In the same fluid motion, she stepped into his personal space, closing the distance between them to eliminate any advantage his superior height and reach might have provided. Her left elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with precisely calculated force, enough to disable his diaphragm and leave him gasping for air, but not enough to cause permanent damage to his internal organs. Blake's grip on Emma's arm loosened involuntarily as his body prioritized the desperate need for oxygen over maintaining his hold on his victim. Emma immediately pulled away, rubbing her arm where finger-shaped bruises were already beginning to form, her expression a mixture of relief and amazement, as she watched her lab partner dismantle their tormentor with movements that seemed almost choreographed in their precision. But Kira wasn't finished. As Blake doubled over, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened to him, she maintained her grip on his wrist and stepped behind him with the fluid movement of someone who had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times. Her positioning was perfect, close enough to maintain control, far enough away to avoid any desperate counterattacks, and angled to prevent Trevor or Jessica from interfering without risking injury to Blake himself. With a quick, precise movement that demonstrated years of training in joint manipulation and pressure point control, Kira hyperextended Blake's elbow joint. She applied exactly enough force to strain his ligaments and tendons without causing permanent damage, creating a level of pain that would immediately end his ability to continue the confrontation while serving as a memorable lesson about the consequences of physical aggression. The sound that filled the hallway was unlike anything most of the student spectators had ever heard. The wet, organic noise of ligaments straining beyond their normal range of motion, followed immediately by Blake's scream of pain and shock. It was a sound that would haunt the dreams of several witnesses and become part of the Roosevelt High School legend that would grow around this confrontation. Blake Morrison, the self-appointed king of Roosevelt High's social hierarchy, collapsed to his knees on the polished linoleum floor, cradling his injured arm against his chest and making sounds that were part scream, part sob, and part disbelieving gasp. For the first time in his life, he was completely and utterly helpless, dependent on the mercy of someone he had tried to victimize. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 5 seconds from Blake's grab for Kira to his collapse on the hallway floor. But in those 5 seconds, the social dynamics of Roosevelt High School had been fundamentally and permanently altered. Trevor Mills, Blake's loyal enforcer and the person most students would have expected to immediately retaliate against anyone who hurt his leader, found himself frozen in place by what he had just witnessed. Trevor had been in dozens of fights throughout his high school career, had developed a reputation for brutal efficiency that kept most students from challenging Blake's authority. But he had never seen anything like the clinical precision with which Kira had dismantled his supposedly invincible friend. Trevor was bigger than Blake, stronger than Blake, and far more experienced in actual physical confrontation than Blake had ever been. Under normal circumstances, he would have immediately attacked anyone who dared to hurt his leader, confident in his ability to overpower them through superior size and aggression. But something about Kira's stance, about the way she had moved with such calculated precision, about the absolute lack of fear or uncertainty in her actions, made him hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, Trevor saw what Blake had missed entirely. Kira wasn't afraid of them. She had never been afraid of them. Her months of apparent submission and vulnerability had been a choice, not a limitation. She had been choosing not to fight, and now that she had made a different choice, Trevor was getting his first glimpse of what lay beneath her carefully maintained facade of helplessness. "Trevor," Kira said calmly, not taking her eyes off Blake's crumpled form, but clearly addressing his hesitant lieutenant. "I'd think very carefully about your next move." Her voice carried the same absolute certainty that had characterized her physical response to Blake's aggression. There was no bluster, no emotional heat, no teenage bravado, just the quiet confidence of someone who had assessed the tactical situation and found it entirely manageable. Trevor had heard that tone before, but only from military personnel and law enforcement officers who possessed both the training and the authority to back up their words with decisive action. For the first time in his life, Trevor Mills found himself genuinely afraid of someone smaller than himself, not afraid of being hurt. He'd been hurt before and would be hurt again, but afraid of being completely outclassed by someone whose capabilities he had fundamentally misunderstood. Looking at Kira's ready stance and remembering the surgical precision with which she had disabled Blake, Trevor realized that attacking her would likely result in his own swift and thorough defeat in front of the entire student body. The crowd of spectators had grown larger and more silent as word of the confrontation spread through the school's informal communication networks. Students emerged from classrooms, appeared at the ends of hallways, and pressed forward to get a better view of something unprecedented in Roosevelt High's social history. Most had never seen their school's established hierarchy challenged so directly and effectively, and certainly had never witnessed the kind of physical competence that Kira had just displayed. Jessica Hartwell, Blake's third partner in the triumvirate that had ruled Roosevelt's social scene through fear and intimidation, had pressed herself against the row of lockers lining the hallway. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor that had drained the color from her face, and her designer clothes seemed suddenly inadequate as protection against the reality of what she had just witnessed. Jessica's power had always been psychological rather than physical, dependent on her alliance with Blake's perceived invincibility. With Blake groaning on the floor and Trevor hesitating to intervene, the foundations of her social authority were crumbling in real time. "You broke my arm!" Blake gasped from his position on the floor, his voice high with pain and disbelief. Kira looked down at him with the clinical detachment of someone assessing the results of a necessary but regrettable action. Her expression was neither satisfied nor sympathetic. It was the face of a professional evaluating whether additional measures might be required to neutralize a continuing threat. "No," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what she had done and why. "I hyperextended your elbow. The ligaments are strained, but there's no permanent damage to the joint or the surrounding bone structure. It'll heal completely in 4 to 6 weeks if you ice it regularly, avoid strenuous activity, and don't do anything stupid enough to re-injure it." The medical accuracy of her assessment was almost as shocking to the assembled students as the violence that had preceded it. This wasn't the random brutality of a typical high school fight. It was the controlled application of force by someone who understood human anatomy, pain management, and the precise calibration of violence necessary to achieve specific tactical objectives. Kira paused, letting her words sink in while continuing to monitor Trevor's position and Jessica's emotional state. Her situational awareness was complete. She knew exactly where every potential threat was positioned, had identified the nearest exits, and was prepared for whatever escalation might occur next. "But if you ever touch Emma again," she continued, her voice dropping to a tone that several witnesses would later describe as absolutely terrifying, "if you ever touch anyone again without their consent, I'll show you what a broken arm actually feels like." The threat was delivered without heat or anger, which somehow made it infinitely more credible than any amount of shouting or posturing would have been. Blake, still writhing on the floor and trying to process the pain radiating from his injured elbow, looked up into Kira's eyes and saw something that chilled him to his core. This wasn't the empty bravado of a teenager trying to sound tough. It was a promise from someone who possessed both the capability and the will to follow through on her words. Emma looked at Kira with an expression that mixed awe, gratitude, and concern in equal measures. She had never seen violence applied with such clinical precision, had never witnessed someone she considered a friend reveal capabilities that seemed to belong in action movies rather than high school hallways. The girl who had been quietly helping her with chemistry homework for months had just demonstrated that she possessed skills that most adults would never develop in a lifetime. "Kira," Emma said softly, her voice carrying genuine concern beneath her obvious relief, "are you okay?" The question seemed to break Kira out of whatever tactical mindset had controlled her actions during the confrontation. She looked around at the faces surrounding them. Some shocked, some frightened, some clearly admiring, and others calculating how this new information about her capabilities might affect their own social positioning. She realized that in defending Emma, she had revealed herself completely and irreversibly. There was no going back to invisibility now, no returning to the careful anonymity that had been her survival strategy for months. The quiet, unassuming girl who read military strategy books during lunch had just demonstrated why such knowledge might be practically relevant. Every student who had witnessed the confrontation would carry this story with them, would reshape their understanding of social hierarchies and personal capabilities based on what they had seen. Kira Blackwood was no longer an unknown quantity. She was someone to be respected, feared, or courted depending on each observer's own position in the complex ecosystem of teenage social dynamics. "I'm fine," she said, offering Emma a small smile that seemed almost casual given the intensity of what had just occurred. "Are you hurt?" Emma shook her head, still rubbing her arm where Blake's grip had left marks, but clearly more shaken by witnessing the confrontation than by her own brief period of victimization. "I'm okay, thank you." The simple exchange of concern between the two girls was observed by dozens of students who were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something unprecedented in Roosevelt High's social history. This wasn't just a fight. It was a fundamental shift in power dynamics, a demonstration that the established order could be challenged and defeated by someone who had seemed powerless just moments before. Blake struggled to his feet with obvious difficulty, still clutching his injured elbow and trying to process the reality of his situation. His face was flushed with pain, humiliation, and a dawning understanding that his reign as Roosevelt High's primary predator had just come to an abrupt and definitive end. For someone who had built his identity around his ability to intimidate and control other students, the experience of being utterly defeated by someone he had considered beneath his notice was psychologically devastating. His injury was real and painful, but it was the damage to his reputation and self-image that would prove more lasting. Every student who had witnessed his defeat would remember the sound he had made when Kira applied pressure to his elbow, would recall the way he had collapsed and begged for mercy from someone he had been trying to victimize. The story would spread throughout the school, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but always maintaining the essential truth. Blake Morrison had been defeated by the quiet girl he had underestimated. "This isn't over," he managed to say through gritted teeth, his voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized his previous interactions with Kira. Kira turned to face him fully, and Blake took an involuntary step backward despite his attempt to project continued defiance. The movement was instinctive, his body's survival mechanisms overriding his conscious desire to maintain some facade of dominance. He had learned, in the most direct way possible, that Kira Blackwood was not someone to be taken lightly. "Yes, it is," she said quietly, her tone carrying the finality of someone who had made a decision that would not be reconsidered or reversed. "You made your choice when you grabbed her. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." The philosophical implications of her statement were not lost on the more thoughtful members of their audience. Kira was articulating a principle that went far beyond the immediate circumstances of their confrontation. The idea that actions have consequences, that choices define character, and that people who choose to victimize others must be prepared to face the results of their decisions. Mr. Henderson, the advanced placement chemistry teacher, finally arrived on the scene with the harried expression of an educator who had heard rumors of trouble but hoped to find a minor issue that could be quickly resolved. His appearance represented the return of adult authority to a situation that had been operating entirely within the brutal but efficient justice system of teenage social dynamics. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking around at the crowd of students and the obvious signs that some kind of confrontation had occurred. His eyes took in Blake's injured posture, the scattered chemistry materials on the floor, and the tense expressions of the students who had witnessed whatever had transpired. Before anyone else could speak, Kira stepped forward with the kind of composure that most adults would struggle to maintain under similar circumstances. Her ability to instantly shift from warrior mode to responsible student mode was yet another indication of the mental discipline that had allowed her to function effectively in the chaotic environment of Roosevelt High School. "Nothing serious, Mr. Henderson," she said, in the tone of a student who wanted to minimize adult involvement in teenage affairs. Blake slipped and hurt his elbow. "Emma and I were just trying to help him figure out whether he needed to see the nurse." Blake opened his mouth to contradict her story, but Trevor grabbed his good arm with enough pressure to communicate a clear message. Trevor had realized, perhaps more quickly than Blake himself, that involving adult authorities in what had just occurred would not work out in their favor. Any investigation would reveal Blake's pattern of harassment, would expose the systematic bullying that had led to this confrontation, and would ultimately result in consequences far more severe than a temporarily injured elbow. "Yeah," Trevor said quickly, his voice lacking its usual confidence, but carrying enough conviction to support Kira's narrative. He just slipped on some spilled something. Clumsy accident. Jessica nodded quickly in agreement, her survival instincts recognizing that discretion was the better part of valor in this particular situation. Getting school administrators involved would mean answering questions about what had led to the confrontation, and those questions would inevitably expose the months of systematic harassment that Blake's group had directed at Kira. Mr. Henderson looked suspicious. He was an experienced teacher who had witnessed countless student conflicts over the years, and he recognized the signs of a situation that was more complex than the simple explanations being offered. But without direct evidence of wrongdoing, and with all the involved parties apparently agreeing on what had occurred, he had little choice but to accept their story and move forward. "All right," he said, with the weary resignation of an adult who understood that student politics operated according to rules he would never fully comprehend. "Everyone get to class. Blake, you should definitely go to the nurse and have that elbow looked at." As the crowd of spectators began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with excitement and speculation about what they had witnessed, Blake fixed Kira with a look of pure hatred. But underneath the anger and humiliation, she could see something else that was new and permanent: fear. For the first time in his life, Blake Morrison had encountered someone who wasn't intimidated by his size, his social status, his family's wealth, or his reputation for cruelty. More importantly, he had learned that his victims weren't necessarily as helpless as they appeared, that quiet compliance could mask capabilities he had never suspected. The comfortable predictability of his world, where he was always the predator and others were always prey, had been shattered by 5 seconds of precisely applied violence that had revealed the fundamental weakness underlying his apparent strength. Trevor and Jessica flanked Blake as he made his way toward the nurse's office, but their body language had changed fundamentally. Instead of the confident swagger of enforcers supporting their leader, they moved with the careful tension of people who had realized they were no longer the most dangerous individuals in their immediate environment. The hierarchies they had spent years establishing and maintaining were being re-evaluated in real time by every student who had witnessed Blake's defeat. As the hallway slowly returned to normal activity levels, with students heading to their afternoon classes and teachers resuming their regular duties, Kira and Emma gathered up the scattered chemistry materials that had been dropped during the confrontation. Most of their carefully prepared samples were ruined, weeks of work destroyed in the few seconds of Blake's aggressive grab for Emma's arm. But both girls understood that the loss of their project materials was insignificant compared to what had been gained. "I can't believe you did that," Emma said quietly as they collected broken glass and contaminated chemical samples. Her voice held a mixture of admiration and concern that reflected her struggle to reconcile the quiet study partner she had known with the warrior who had just dismantled Blake Morrison with clinical precision. Kira looked up from where she was carefully disposing of dangerous chemical residues that could cause burns if mishandled. "He shouldn't have touched you," she said simply, as if the decision to intervene physically had been as natural and inevitable as any chemical reaction they had studied in their laboratory work. "But where did you learn to do that? That was like something out of a movie." The question was inevitable, and Kira had been preparing for it since the moment she decided to reveal her capabilities. She could have deflected or minimized what had occurred, could have tried to maintain some version of her previous anonymity, but the time for hiding was over, and Emma deserved an honest answer. "My father taught me," she said, meeting Emma's eyes directly. "He's been training me since I was 12, self-defense, martial arts, tactical thinking. He wanted me to be able to protect myself when he couldn't be there to do it." Emma nodded slowly, beginning to understand the depth of preparation that had made Kira's response possible. "Your father must be an interesting man." He's seen some difficult things in his career, Kira replied, carefully avoiding specifics about Colonel Blackwood's military service. He wanted to make sure I could handle difficult situations if they arose. The news of the confrontation spread through Roosevelt High School like wildfire, carried by the informal communication networks that existed in every educational institution. By the end of the school day, everyone knew that quiet Kira Blackwood had put Blake Morrison on the floor, with moves that belonged in professional combat rather than high school hallways. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core truth remained consistent. The girl everyone had dismissed as weak and vulnerable had revealed herself to be anything but helpless. Students who had never spoken to Kira before began approaching her with mixture of curiosity, respect, and carefully calculated friendliness. Some wanted to hear her version of what had occurred, others hoped to position themselves as allies rather than potential enemies, and a few seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the person behind the legend that was already forming around her actions. The social dynamics of Roosevelt High School shifted dramatically in the days that followed Blake's humiliation. Students who had been targets of his crew began to find their voices, inspired by Kira's example to stand up for themselves and others. The hallways became measurably less hostile as Blake's network of followers realized that their protection was no longer guaranteed and that their victims might be more dangerous than they appeared. Blake himself returned to school 3 days later with his arm in a professional sling, claiming to anyone who asked that he had been injured in a football practice accident. But everyone knew the truth, and the knowledge that Blake Morrison could be defeated, had been defeated, fundamentally altered how other students perceived him and themselves. Trevor Mills and Jessica Hartwell gave Kira a wide berth, no longer confident in their ability to intimidate someone who had demonstrated such complete mastery over their supposedly invincible leader. Their withdrawal from active harassment created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by students who had previously been too afraid to assert themselves. The careful balance of fear and dominance that had maintained Roosevelt's social hierarchy was permanently disrupted by 5 seconds of precisely applied justice. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kira herself. She no longer walked through the hallways with her head down or hid behind the protective curtain of her hair. Her posture remained respectful and non-threatening, but there was a new confidence in the way she carried herself, a quiet certainty that she was capable of handling whatever challenges might arise. She still dressed simply and spoke softly, but her presence had taken on a different quality. Students who had previously overlooked her completely now noticed when she entered a room. Teachers found themselves paying closer attention to her contributions in class, recognizing an intellectual intensity that matched her newly revealed physical capabilities. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to be a victim. Her father's training had given her the tools to defend herself, but the decision to use those tools and the wisdom to use them appropriately had come from her own moral courage and tactical judgment. Emma Rodriguez became her closest friend, and their partnership in chemistry class blossomed into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. They studied together, ate lunch together, and discovered that they shared interests in classic literature, foreign films, and the kind of subtle humor that made teenage social dynamics bearable. For the first time in years, Kira felt like she truly belonged somewhere, like she had found someone who understood and appreciated her for who she really was. Their chemistry project had to be completely restarted due to the damage caused during the confrontation, but working together on the new version gave them additional opportunities to develop their friendship. Emma's intelligence and curiosity complemented Kira's analytical nature, and their collaboration produced results that exceeded what either could have accomplished working alone. One afternoon, about a month after the confrontation, Kira was walking to her locker to collect books for her evening homework when she found Blake Morrison waiting for her. He was alone, his arm finally free of its sling, and his expression was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Gone was the confident swagger and predatory calculation that had characterized their previous encounters. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, uncertain, and genuinely remorseful. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lacking the commanding tone that had once made other students automatically defer to his wishes. Kira studied his face carefully, using the threat assessment skills her father had taught her to evaluate his emotional state and intentions. She found no signs of deception or hidden aggression, no indication that this was some kind of trap or manipulation. Blake Morrison looked like what he was, a young man who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and was trying to figure out how to move forward. "Okay," she said simply, positioning herself to maintain situational awareness while giving him the opportunity to speak. Blake glanced around the mostly empty hallway to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then took a deep breath that suggested he had been rehearsing this conversation in his mind for weeks. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might lose his nerve if he didn't speak quickly. "For what I did to you, for what I did to Emma, for everything I put you through since you arrived at Roosevelt." Kira waited silently, recognizing that Blake needed to work through whatever internal process had led him to this moment. Interrupting him now would prevent him from completing whatever journey of self-reflection had brought him here. "I know that saying sorry doesn't undo any of the harm I caused," Blake continued, his voice growing steadier as he found his rhythm. "I know it doesn't excuse the way I treated you or make up for the months of harassment you endured because of me and my friends." The admission was more comprehensive and thoughtful than Kira had expected. Blake wasn't just apologizing for the immediate incident that had led to his injury. He was acknowledging the entire pattern of systematic bullying that had characterized their relationship since her arrival at Roosevelt High. "Why?" Kira asked finally, her tone neutral, but genuinely curious about what had motivated this apparent change in his character. Blake looked down at his hands, which bore faint scars from various athletic activities, and the kind of careless confidence that came from never having to worry about physical threats. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought making other people feel small would make me feel bigger, more important, more secure in my place in the world, but it just made me smaller as a person." The psychological insight was surprisingly mature, suggesting that Blake had spent considerable time reflecting on the motivations behind his behavior. His analysis went beyond simple regret to demonstrate a genuine understanding of the psychological mechanisms that had driven his cruelty. Blake met her eyes directly for the first time since beginning his apology. "My mother found out what really happened that day in the hallway. She made me understand that I was becoming someone I didn't want to be, someone who used fear and pain to maintain relationships that weren't really relationships at all." Kira nodded slowly, recognizing the influence of adult guidance in Blake's newfound self-awareness. Mrs. Morrison had clearly played a crucial role in forcing her son to confront the reality of his actions and their consequences. "And what do you want to be?" Kira asked, genuinely interested in his answer. Blake considered the question carefully before responding. "Better than I was," he said. "Someone who helps people instead of hurting them. Someone who uses whatever advantages I have to make things better for others instead of making things worse." It was an admirable goal, though Kira understood that transforming intentions into consistent action would be the real test of Blake's character development. But his recognition that he possessed advantages that could be used constructively rather than destructively suggested a level of maturity that hadn't been apparent in his previous behavior. Apology accepted, Kira said after a moment of consideration. The forgiveness was genuine. Holding on to resentment would serve no constructive purpose, and Blake's apparent sincerity deserved acknowledgement. But as Blake started to turn away, clearly relieved to have completed what had obviously been a difficult conversation, Kira added a final comment that made him pause. Blake? Yeah? If you ever hurt someone again, if you ever make someone else feel the way you made me feel during those first months at Roosevelt, I'll finish what I started in that hallway, and next time, I won't hold back. Blake swallowed hard, his body's autonomic nervous system responding to the quiet certainty in her voice, even as his rational mind processed her words. He understood that this wasn't an idle threat or teenage posturing. It was a promise from someone who had already demonstrated both the capability and the will to follow through on her commitments. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Blake walked away, moving with less confidence than he had displayed before their confrontation, but with what appeared to be greater self-awareness, Kira reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at Roosevelt High School. She had come here hoping to be invisible, trying to avoid conflict through anonymity and careful non-engagement with the social dynamics that govern teenage interaction. But invisibility, she had learned, was not always possible or desirable. Sometimes the only way to find peace was to be willing to fight for it, to demonstrate that certain lines could not be crossed without consequences. Her father's training had given her the tools to enforce those boundaries when necessary, but the wisdom to know when enforcement was appropriate had come from her own moral development and tactical judgment. She thought about Colonel Blackwood's words, "A smart warrior chooses their battles." She had chosen this battle not because she wanted to fight, but because the alternative, allowing Blake to continue victimizing others with impunity, was morally unacceptable. In making that choice, she had discovered that strength wasn't about the ability to hurt others, but about the courage to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The final bell of the school day rang, its electronic tone echoing through the hallways of Roosevelt High School and signaling the end of another chapter in the ongoing drama of teenage social development. Kira gathered her books and headed for the exit, where Emma was waiting with a smile and a joke about their latest chemistry assignment. As they walked toward the parking lot together, passing the spots where some of Kira's most difficult experiences at Roosevelt had occurred, she realized that she was no longer trying to be invisible. She was exactly where she belonged, seen, respected, understood, and unafraid. The quiet storm had found her voice, had learned to balance strength with restraint, had discovered that true power came not from dominating others, but from protecting what mattered most. Roosevelt High School would never be the same, and neither would she.